University student, to you, when I was 19 years old, and I was a fanatic reader. And this actually, somewhere in this store is where I got a lot of the first books I ever read about Buddhism. And I have memories of kind of going through the shelves and finding little gems, and always trying to get a good deal. I was always kind of fundamentally cheap, so trying to get any kind of dollar go a long way. So to be here in Majors and Quinn, that's, it's such a an important place for those of us who are kind of book nerds here in the Twin Cities. So to be here with all of you, to be here with you, Penny, and to be here in Majors and Quinn is just I couldn't imagine a more special place to help bring this book into the world. So happy to be here with you all.
Before we begin, I just thought we might know how many of you here are part of the Tergar community? And how many here are relatively new to Buddhism and the meditation and the science of that? Thank you. Okay. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask questions for roughly 30 minutes, and Cortland will talk, and then we will do 30 minutes of Q&A, and in between a short meditation practice. And then after that, he'll be signing books. All right, so to get started, why did you write this book, and who is your intended audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is probably a strange thing to say about a book you just wrote, but actually I had no intention to write this book to begin with. But the publisher, or an editor at Shambhala Publications, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with Shambhala, it's one of the two major publishers of books on meditation and Buddhism in the English language. An editor just sent me an email, kind of cold called me one day and asked if I would be willing to write a book, an introductory book on Buddhism. And I was flattered to be asked, but I also had a deficit of free time when that happened, and so I politely declined. And she wrote again a few months later, and again I declined. But as she reached out a few more times and we kept an active conversation, I started to remember my own early experiences as a meditator, which I mentioned a moment ago. And I was kind of looking for a book that just laid out what Buddhism is all about, not from a philosophical point of view or an academic point of view, but what does a life as a meditator look like in this tradition? And I'd already been meditating, but more in a kind of mindfulness, just watch your breath kind of way. So part of it really sparked my interest of just thinking the book that I was looking for at the time. And the other thing that really motivated me was the work I've done with the Theravada meditation community, working with Mingyur Rinpoche, where I've helped develop a lot of courses over the years. And there too, we have courses that are kind of for people who are new to Buddhism or just kind of interested, not necessarily wanting to become Buddhist, but are just wanting to know what the tradition is all about. And there too, there were a lot of books that I felt like were great second books on Buddhism, but there was never that book like, oh, here's the first one that just sort of lays out, especially from the Tibetan point of view, like here's what the tradition is all about. So I think it's that combination of my own experience, thinking of the book that I had wanted at the time, and also just seeing some gaps, despite the many, many fantastic books that are out there, that there's still some gaps there in the literature of what we find these days.
And I might mention that there are two more books following this one that you will keep your eye out for. You might start by talking about the Four Noble Truths and the journey of Siddhartha and that story for those who don't know that story. That might be a helpful thing. You talk about it in the book, but would you be willing to share that story?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this is a central theme in the book, but there's a lot about the life of the Buddha himself, and this is something that is a little bit different about the Buddhist tradition relative to other spiritual and religious traditions, in that it's not based on a god or gods or a pantheon of gods, but really on the human experience. And the life of the Buddha, who was a person who lived, there's historical debates about this, but 2,400, 2,500 years ago, his life story and the experiences that he had are, to this day, are a huge part of the tradition. And I think for many of us, certainly me, and many others who have practiced Buddhism and followed these teachings, it's just been a helpful way to help us learn a little bit more about the human condition, both the challenges and the potential that we have as humans. So there's a lot about this in the book, and there's of course been many things written about the historical Buddha, but perhaps the thing that really inspired me is really just this idea of you have this person who played the game of life as it was taught, and he checked all the boxes, like, okay, have a good relationship, have enough money, have, a good family, a good job. Like he kind of checked all the boxes and still felt that something's missing here. I've done everything the world is telling me I need to do to be happy and to feel fulfilled, but somehow it's just I'm not feeling that sense of contentment and ease or just feeling at home in the world that I've always been looking for. And that very human experience that he had, and that many people have, is what kind of set him off on the path of meditation, eventually to his awakening under the Bodhi tree in ancient India, and kind of set in motion the entire Buddhist traditions. So the Four Noble Truths that you mentioned, Penny, that was basically the first teaching that he gave after he had these insights coming from his own personal path, that really just attempted to lay out why suffering happens, how it can be transformed, and how we can train our mind through meditation and really uproot the causes and conditions for suffering and dissatisfaction. So it's a very human story and a human tradition in many ways.
Is there a short way to say what the Four Noble Truths are?
Yeah, so in short, the first two Noble Truths are the Noble Truth of suffering and the Noble Truth of the causes of suffering. So the analogy that's given is like if you have an illness, you first need to pinpoint, you need to diagnose the illness. You need to know that there is an actual illness. And then if there's going to be a hope for a cure, you need to get at the causes, like what's causing that illness to arise in the first place. So in this analogy, the illness is suffering, the causes are ignorance, attachment, and aversion, and there's a whole lot to say about that. And then the third and the fourth Noble Truths are the truths of cessation, basically that it's possible to bring an end to suffering. And the fourth Noble Truth is the path, basically what is the step-by-step process where you can train your mind to slowly let go of all those things that are causing suffering and basically live in the world in a very different way.
See, he does it really well, don't you think? It's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Shifting it just a little bit, there's a quote that I love from Shanti Deva, and it says, if there's something to be done, why worry? If there's nothing to be done, why worry? I worry a lot, and anxiety is something I suspect I share with probably others in this room. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how meditation and the path that you're talking about helps with anxiety. And would you share Mingyur Rinpoche's story about panic?
Yeah. So I think one of the really beautiful things about the Buddhist approach to working with the mind is that there's a focus less on what's broken and more on what never was broken and doesn't need to be fixed. And I think there's so much in our world where we're just constantly being taught that there's things that are wrong with us. We need to fix our relationships and fix our health and get a better job. And there's just we're on this endless march of trying to improve ourselves and deal with all the flaws and shortcomings of ourselves and the world and our relationships and our health and a million other things. And Buddhism is really just about a very different way of seeing ourselves and seeing our own minds, and seeing in particular the parts that aren't, and will never be broken. So how can we get in touch with innate qualities and capacities that we all have, and then just nurturing them. So it's kind of as though we're learning first to just bring them into focus. How do we see these qualities of our own being? And then to live from that place of staying connected to that. So yeah, there's a lot to say about that too, but I think it's just a kind of a very different way of seeing ourselves. So when you apply that to anxiety, or you could really to a whole range of things that we experience as humans, it's less about how do you fix anxiety, how can you get rid of anxiety, but actually by exploring the anxiety. And that was my experience too as a college student. I had a ton of anxiety, and I think that was a part of what drove me or prompted me to want to learn to meditate. But that became, in many ways, my greatest teacher, and I don't think a lot of the things I've benefited from in my own life, the practices I've studied and the principles I've learned, I think have come largely from that. But again, it's a process not of fixing the flaws, like in this case anxiety, but of seeing that at the root of all of that is actually something pretty wholesome and pure, and we just need to get in touch with these qualities of our own minds.
It's related to the Buddha nature, right?
Yeah.
How,
Yeah,
how,
exactly.
how about Mingyur Rinpoche's story about what exactly happened with his panic?
So Mingyur Rinpoche is the guiding teacher of the Tergar community, who you've kind of heard that a few times now, and he's a well-known meditation teacher around the world, for those of you who aren't familiar with him. And he has a kind of a fascinating story because he grew up really in one of the most amazing settings you could imagine in the Himalayan mountains. Like you could hardly imagine a more idyllic, stunning setting. So he has this perfect kind of place that he was born. His parents were meditation masters. Like his father was one of the great meditation masters of his generation. His mom, his grandparents, like he just basically was surrounded by people who were just totally steeped in this meditative tradition. Like you couldn't imagine a better setup for a little kid, right? I mean, just like everything was going his way. But despite everything seemingly being perfect on the outside, he had panic attacks from the time he was a little kid. From the time he was, I think, about 7.
It was a thunder, right? Thunder would trigger it. And
Yeah, he would get, so he had, so in the area where he lived, you'd have like these intense thunderstorms. And he would literally think he was gonna die. I mean, you can imagine this little 7-year-old kid just totally and utterly terrified. So he had genuine panic attacks. Like he really, thought he was on the verge of death in these moments. And he had intense social anxiety. He could hardly be around strangers. He would just completely lose it and kind of need to, isolate himself. So despite having seemingly everything on the outside, he really was struggling internally. But that, like for so many of us, his huge challenges he had in life is what motivated him to make a change and to look for something different. So there's this whole cute story where he asked his mom to ask his dad, who was this great meditation teacher, if he would teach him meditation, which of course he was, I'm sure, thrilled to do. But he was kind of very shyly asked. And then he had this remarkable story where he, I think he was in his, how old was he when he started his 3-year retreat? 13? 12 or 13, something like that. So imagine this. I don't know what you were doing when you were 12 or 13. I know what I was doing, and I was not entering a long meditation retreat. My parents would have been delighted. My mom probably would have been very happy that I was Alas, that was not what I was up to when I was 13. Nonetheless, he not only did a 3-year retreat, which is like a cloistered retreat where you literally don't leave a building and you're meditating 12 to 15 hours a day for 3 years straight. At the end of that, which leaves him at like 15, 16 years old, he then became the retreat teacher for the next retreat. So he's a 15-year-old, and he was teaching monks who were in their 30s, 40s, 50 years old. This little kid was actually teaching this incredibly intensive meditation period. But as part of that, in the early stage of this 3-year retreat, he basically was on the verge of a mental breakdown. He was trying to get rid of his panic, and he was using meditation basically as a tool to go to war with his mind. And he learned what a lot of meditators learn, which is you can't, if you go to war with your own mind, you're just going to have a lot of pain and agony. And eventually he opened up to the suffering he was experiencing, to the panic, and eventually it just completely, that process of opening up to what was going on with him and within him at the time completely transformed him, and he's now an amazing meditation teacher. Not only that, but we've had him in the lab at the Center for Healthy Minds. He has scientifically one of the youngest brains for his age that has ever been documented.
Wow.
Like we've had him in a series of scientific studies, and we've published a case report on him where after this long period of retreat, he was like statistically so far on the side of the basically slowing down the normal age-related decay that happens in the brain. Anyways, that's another little tangent. very fascinating guy.
So he made friends with his panic.
Yeah, he basically stopped fighting the panic and then leaned into it, began to explore it. In his language, he would say he made friends with the panic. You can say that a lot more acutely than I can do, but really, just use meditation to explore it from the inside rather than trying to use meditation to get rid of it, which is
Which is
often-
similar to a lot of things. I mean, you do the same thing, you know, with pain or hunger or whatever.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
just be with it. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Tell us about the three yanas. You talk a lot about the three yanas as the vehicles that can help us to better flourishing, better mental well-being. Tell us what those are.
So the book, the architecture of the book is a set of teachings that in Tibetan Buddhism are called the three yanas, which basically means the three vehicles. That is utterly unclarifying, I realize. But basically the idea is this experience of suffering, or you might say of chronic dissatisfaction, like we do all these things in our lives and somehow it just doesn't bring that lasting sense of feeling at home in the world that we're looking for. And the question is, okay, if there's some way we can get to the other side of that, if there's some other way to be in the world where we're not suffering this much, how do we get there? How do we get from A to B? And these yanas, these vehicles, are kind of how we do that. In other words, it's really the process by which you can train the mind through meditation and other practices to begin to explore your inner experience and through that to transform the mind. So there's a lot of interesting kind of historical context here. Buddhism began in India roughly 2,500 years ago, and then slowly over time it spread to different parts of Asia and then eventually of course beyond Asia. And in different historical contexts, when it went to different regions, it reflected the stage of evolution that Buddhism had reached at that time. So when it went, for example, to China and East Asia, it was earlier than the point at which it went to Tibet. At the time it went to Tibet, it was a time in India where it was kind of like a period where all these different strands of meditation practice, of Buddhist thinking and philosophy were kind of being woven together and synthesized. And that's the flavor of Buddhism that you find in Tibet. So the way that the Tibetan tradition talks to itself is in terms of these three yanas. So it's like you have three different approaches, and rather than it being like you're going to pick one of them, or one of them's better or worse than the other, you kind of weave together elements of all three, and you find ways to distill the key points of these traditions into practical ways that you can apply them in daily life. So this is really the entirety of the book. So it's basically like summarizing, 300 pages, which is itself summarizing God knows how much. But just to say a little bit, like some of the key points of each of these. With the first of the three yanas, which is called the foundational vehicle, one of the key points of this approach is the idea of renunciation. And renunciation is probably sounds kind of painful, sounds like it's discipline, like you basically, like we have to give up the stuff we like. But really in the Buddhist tradition, it's about reorienting the mind to what is meaningful. How we can see that there's certain things we do, we get caught in just patterns of thinking and acting and being in the world, that even though it's not really fulfilling to us, we just kind of keep doing it. We keep kind of doing the same thing over and over and over, expecting different results, right?
Yeah.
It's that simple. And so renunciation from that point of view is just seeing that, like, okay, I'm doing the same thing for the 50th time. I mean, the best example now is just the infinite scroll on the phone, right? Like how many times you're just scrolling and you don't particularly feel good. When you end, you're not like, wow, I'm so glad I just spent, that was the best, like that doesn't happen, right? It's like, the 20 years ago it would have been channel surfing. You just sit there and you're just like flipping through channels and it just feels kind of hollow at the end of it. But yet we do it. We just keep going and we do it over and over again. So renunciation is kind of a combination of seeing, all right, that's not working out. I can't keep doing the same thing and expecting something totally different is going to happen. That doesn't make sense. So it's letting go of the outdated way of seeing things And then just seeing that there's another alternative, there's another way to do this, and what might that be? So it's more of an inspired turning towards a new possibility and letting go of what's not working is a way of thinking about it. So that's at the heart of the foundational vehicle. When you move to the second vehicle, it becomes a lot about compassion and service. So at the beginning, it's seeing about your own life. I'm suffering, my problems. What's a different way to do this thing called being human? And then you start to see that I'm not alone here. Everybody's struggling. Everybody's suffering. Everybody might not have exactly the issues I have, but they have something, right? And so why not make the well-being of everyone and everything at the heart of my path? So it's about opening the heart. The third tradition, the third yana, which is called the Vajrayana or Vajra vehicle, is really a complete shift in how we see ourselves. And this goes back to the idea that you mentioned, Penny, of Buddha nature. So we let go of seeing ourselves in light of our flaws and shortcomings, and the idea of Buddha nature comes to the fore. So we don't see our own path as like we're going to work towards some awakening or insight or whatever it is we're looking for, and that's going to happen in the future. Instead, it's seeing that actually those things we're looking for actually are here right now. And the problem is just we haven't learned to see them. We're so focused externally. We're so focused on success and health and a million other things that we really just never learn to look at our own minds. And when we do that, we start to see that actually a lot of that contentment, ease, feeling at home in the world, actually these are qualities we can tap into anytime and anywhere. We just need to learn how to experience them. So there's a lot to say about these three yanas, but that's kind of at the essence of it.
You talk also about bodhicitta. I think I pronounced that right, and that it's like jet fuel for the practice and for our well-being. Can you tell people what that is? And how you have an example, right?
Yeah.
Some sort of story.
I was going to try to make this a surprise for you, but
I just learned this.
so bodhicitta, in a nutshell, is related to that idea of compassion, and it's the idea that the motivation for your own practice is not only your own well-being or even your own awakening or whatever you're looking for in life, but to help all beings recognize their own awakened potential. That simply put. And that becomes kind of the guiding force for one's spiritual path and meditation practice. And this is something you hear Buddhist teachers like the Dalai Lama or Mingyur Rinpoche, they talk about this endlessly. So the Dalai Lama, if we had him here and we were saying, okay, what's the most important thing about the Buddhist path? I can pretty much guarantee he wouldn't probably even mention mindfulness. I think he'd say bodhicitta. I think he'd say it's compassion and working for the welfare of others. I think that's probably what if he was here and we asked him, I think that's probably what he'd say. And it is so incredibly powerful as a force, as a potential to nurture and practice. Because a lot of the time we come to the world almost looking at it from the point of view of our needs. Like the world needs to give us something so we can finally feel like we have enough or we're complete or we have whatever it is that we think we're lacking. And not to say that there's not some utility to that, because I think there certainly can be, and there's a time and place to focus on one's needs. But if that is the fundamental viewpoint you have on life, the implicit assumption of that is that one is not complete or enough in that moment. It's almost like an addiction to not feeling enough. Whereas when you come to situations from the point of view of compassion, it's coming to the world with a full heart. It's coming from a place of feeling full rather than empty. And I, having worked with this, actually there's a story in the book that I didn't even tell Penny until just a few minutes before we got here. Actually, is a story about Penny and her husband Bill, that just is an example of this for me. So I started a nonprofit in 2004, and for those of you who've worked in the nonprofit space, you'll know that fundraising is just kind of comes with the territory. And actually a lot of connections. Stephanie Chu Grossman, who was an early board member for the Remade Foundation, and helpful in so many ways, introduced me to Penny and her husband Bill. And the first time I ever went over there to meet them, and they have a family foundation that supports many things throughout our community, and I knew that there was this potential that they could, one day potentially support the work we were doing. And I got there early, like 15 minutes early, and I still remember this perfectly. I was parked in the back, and just sitting in my car, and I was there early, so I thought, okay, I'm just gonna sit here. And I was just reflecting on what was going on in my own mind at the moment. And I realized I was going in to talk to these two people who I hadn't even met before. And I was, if I was kind of totally honest, it's kind of embarrassing to say this. I've like said this impersonally in the book and other ways, but honestly, I didn't know them yet, and I think I was viewing them as a checkbook. Like, oh, I hope they'll just write out a check. That's what I want in this moment. It's like, and it was, I had kind of, even before I'd met them, I had sort of dehumanized the whole situation. And I realized this, and I thought, I don't want to go into this human relationship. I don't want to enter into this and to have that be the dynamic of this first encounter I'm going to have with these people who I haven't met. And I had been studying this principle of compassion in bodhicitta, and I just thought about that, and I did a little reflection in my mind that I have done countless times since. I do it probably on a daily basis now, because I found it so helpful in that moment. And I thought to myself, you know what? I want whatever comes of this to be what will be of most service to humanity. And if we just have a great conversation and that's all that comes of it, if that's what is going to allow it, if that's what will be of most benefit to the world, may that be what happens. If we have an amazing connection and we collaborate and that goes on for years, may that be what happens. If they just throw me out the door and tell me to get out, if that's going to be of the most benefit to humanity, then may that be what happens. And it just completely unlocked my mind about kind of wanting any outcome, and just instead orienting to like whatever happens here, just be what will benefit others the most, and being open to however that may look. And we went in, we had a fantastic conversation, as you could tell. She hasn't thrown me out of any doors since then. So far, so good. But even when I sit down to meditate, actually I do that same thing now. I didn't before then, but I'll sit down and meditate. I'll just say, if it's better for my mind to be a distracted mess for the next half hour, if that's going to help people, may that happen. If it's better that my mind is clear and calm, and that's going to help people, may that be what happens. And it's just a way of recentering my mind and my motivation on being of service to others. And I've just found that just to be incredibly, endlessly motivating and fulfilling. So that's just one example of how I practice bodhicitta in my own life. But I think, for so many of us who practice these teachings, it's a huge part of the practice.
That's just such a good example. I mean, we've all had those experiences where we would see something we want to see, and we're not really seeing the person. So.
Yeah, it's like
and now there's a concept
just
where we can get out
expectations.
of that.
Yeah. So
it's now time for questions from you all, but before that, I think Cortland would like to lead us in a small meditation.
Yeah, we thought maybe it would be good to do a little bit of meditation practice since we're all together. So this will be just a few moments, and I thought I could weave in two elements that for me have been part of the most nourishing elements of my own Buddhist practice. One of them around compassion, which I just mentioned. The other one is really the practice of being and letting go of all the busy doing energy of the mind. So just do a few minutes of meditation. So you can start by bringing awareness into your body. You can keep your eyes gently open or closed, whatever feels more natural. And take a few slow, deep, calming breaths and notice how the air feels as it moves in and out of your body. We're in a room full of other people, so there's a tendency not to actually take a deep breath, but you can really do that. So go ahead and take a full deep breath. Feel the movement of your breath. You don't need to concentrate intensely. No intense mental effort needed. Just notice what that feels like. And see if you can drop into a state of simply being. There's no special state of mind you need to be experiencing. Doesn't matter if your mind is busy or calm, if your body is relaxed or agitated. Just simply be as you are in this moment. Bring a light awareness to all the many things that are happening within you and around you. You can start by noticing what you hear. Noticing what you see. If your eyes are closed, perhaps noticing the play of light on your eyelids. Notice all the shapes and colors, the field of vision if your eyes are open. Shifting awareness into your own body, notice how you feel right now. Notice the feeling of your feet touching the ground. Your hands on your lap or your thighs. Notice the feeling of your body moving as you breathe. Now for a few moments, just sit. Nothing special to do other than experiencing this moment fully, whatever that may be. Your mind will likely wander into distraction many times. That is completely normal. So just notice your mind as it wanders, as your mind fills with thoughts. Widen the aperture of awareness to stay connected to everything else that's happening in this moment. last few moments can end on a note of compassion. You can think of your own life, the rest, all the chapters of your own life that you have yet to write. And see if you can form the motivation that through your time left on this planet, you might bring a little more happiness, goodness, flourishing into the world. That you might help others to suffer less and flourish more in whatever way resonates with you. So just take a few moments to see if you could form that compassionate motivation to leave the world a little better than you found it. And slowly open your eyes if they've been closed. And I think we have some time for some Q&A. If there's any comments or questions.
Michael, do these come apart so people can be heard?
Not easily, but if you just want to speak up, it would be fine. I think we're all pretty close. You could all hear me, I assume. So.
Greg?
Start with a question. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
And I know it must take a lot to write a book on top of everything else you do. So for that gift, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the great challenges of attachment in life is to family, to children, to friends. And when I hear about compassion being sent broadly, you can talk about the challenge of attachment to relations.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So attachment is a big theme in Buddhism. And Buddhism is very precise. A lot of what you find in the Buddhist tradition is almost like a mapping of the terrain of the mind, mental states, and emotions. And attachment has a very specific meaning because especially for those of you who have a background in psychology, of course there's healthy attachment, like the way we construe that and think of that is a little bit different than we find in the Buddhist tradition. So it's good to be precise what we're talking about, because we're not talking about the healthy attachment, that you might find in Western psychology. In a Buddhist sense, what attachment is pointing to is a mental distortion in which we get overly fixated on the positive qualities of something, and we screen out anything that might be less desirable. So fundamentally, it's a state where we're just not seeing clearly, and we get a little obsessive about the things we like, and we just kind of ignore the stuff that we might not like. So from that point of view, I think you could say the healthy attachment that we think of in Western psychology, that's not at all what we're talking about. I think that, even from a Buddhist point of view, would be a very positive thing, certainly like in relationships with family and whatnot. I think what Buddhist meditation is helping us to do is first to disentangle all of our thoughts, our expectations, our unconscious beliefs, and our assumptions, and just bring them up to the level of awareness so we can see that they're happening, rather than they're just like the lens through which we're viewing the world and we don't even realize that they're distorting how we're seeing things. So it's just learning to see all of the mental conditioning and emotional and psychological patterns that are there in the mind a little bit more clearly. And in seeing that clearly, another shift that can happen is we start living a little less up in our head, a little less dictated by our beliefs, and a little bit more in the immediacy of what's actually happening in front of us. So the influence that all of our expectations and assumptions and unconscious beliefs play in shaping our perception slowly diminishes a little bit, and our capacity just to see what's really going on in the moment increases. So you can see this with, I've been fortunate to have to spend some time with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you can see the result of this in somebody who's practiced as deeply as he has. And he's, despite having this grueling schedule of traveling around the world and having done this for decades and decades, he evidently gets up, I think it's something like 3 every morning, and practices, basically meditates for like 5 hours every single day of his life, which is kind of amazing when you think of like somebody. It's one thing if you're just hanging out and on vacation, but I mean, it's like he is, just incredible amount of meetings and events and travel and all sorts of things, and he's doing that all the time. One of the things that you see is that there's this ability to move from one situation or one context to another without this almost the stickiness where like the emotions you feel in one moment you kind of carry into the next moment. So for example, he'll be hearing from one person. You've probably seen this too, because I know you've spent time with him. Like somebody will tell a story, they'll be really sad, and he'll just be crying with them. But the very next moment, somebody tells a joke, and he'll just be laughing hysterically. And there's no stickiness. It's like you can just shift, because it's not all this normal mental emotional processing where you might have an argument in the morning and then you're lying in bed at night and still the emotions and the thoughts from that argument are like still stuck in your system, and we kind of accumulate this stuff. Sometimes it's from our childhood and we're literally still carrying that with us decades later. That of course is not easy to be in the world in a different way, but you can see the potential of that, of somebody who's so deeply steeped in compassion and trained their mind in this way. It's basically that capacity to just be very, very in the moment. So again, what shifts there back to the question is that there's that very healthy attachment in the sense that there can be deep, deep connections with the people in your life, but without that distortion where we're kind of coloring everything with all the layers of beliefs and expectations and assumptions that usually we're not even aware we're having in the moment. And so that's a lot of the training, is just how to do
Wanting people
that.
to be different than they are.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Wanting everything, people, situations, the world, everything we want to be different than it is. Yeah, great question.
Anybody else?
Can I ask you about bodhicitta? Because a long time ago, I was with you with this
Yes, we'll go
book.
that far. Why don't you go?
Oh, sorry. A long time ago, Genpo, who was a teacher here in Cortland, that's where I met Cortland. Anyway, when you talk about bodhicitta, he said it's compassion, but it's also wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So can you speak to that? What do they mean by wisdom?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. That's another great question. And that too is like a very classical, especially in the way you hear in the Tibetan tradition, the way that kind of the path is summarized to its most essential components. You could say it's just wisdom and compassion. And then the traditional analogy is that those are likened to 2 wings of a bird, like you need both to fly. If you have just compassion with no wisdom, not much is going to happen. If you just have wisdom with no compassion, also not much is going to happen. So it's really this kind of potent combination of both of them. The wisdom, I would say, is what we were just talking about. It's learning to see things more clearly. So it starts by just learning through meditation how the mind is working. And it's not about a belief system. It's not as though the goal of this is to form the right belief system about how things are working. It's more a direct observation of experience, and through that you have this experiential insight and understanding. You just directly see, like I talked about that sitting in my car before I met you. It's just like I was just observing my mind and seeing a particular pattern playing out and saying, okay, this isn't like the direction I want to go right now. And in seeing that clearly, it allows for a whole range of possibilities that you don't have. So just seeing clearly. In fact, the word insight, which is one of the main forms of meditation, in Tibetan the word is haktom, and literally it just means clear seeing or the best seeing. It just means, again, you're just seeing things more clearly than we normally do. A funny example of this coming more from the scientific work that I've been involved with, but it illustrates this very well. There's been a lot of research that scientists have done on mindfulness, and one of the strangest findings is that binge drinking college drinkers in one study report higher levels of mindfulness than Thai Buddhist monks. So no offense to any college students in the audience, but what are the chances that binge drinking college students actually are more mindful than Thai Buddhist monks? How likely is that? Probably not so likely, right? So what would explain that? It's just because people are not trained to observe their inner experience. We just don't have, in scientific terms, we don't have what is called introspective accuracy. We are not accurate judges of what's going on in our own minds. And that's not a personal failing. It's like, why would we? We have not been trained to do that. We haven't learned the skills to do that. So it's not as though there's anything wrong. So another finding from scientific research that shows that is that what we find in, we've been doing a lot of large scale studies at the Center for Healthy Minds, and what we routinely find is that on a range of measures, this could be mindfulness, it could be attention, it could be feelings of connection, a whole range of things, is that when people learn to meditate and you measure them, we take baseline measures, like we do a bunch of measurements before they do, this is using the Healthy Minds app, which is an application we developed. So we take all these measurements before they use it, and then we take measurements every week for 4 weeks, and then we usually do like a 3 or 6 month follow-up. What we usually find is that there's the baseline measurements, and then at week 1, things go down. It looks like they're getting worse. So this is a topic of intense interest for us, because what we think is happening is not that it's getting worse, it's that introspective accuracy is getting better. It's basically that at that baseline moment, the measurement was inaccurate because people had not learned to say, if I asked somebody, how attentive are you throughout the day? And you'd say, oh, I'm a 4 out of 5. Well, you start paying attention to your mind for a week, and I ask you again, how attentive are you? You'd be like, well, I'm a 1, maybe 2, right? And you just got better at assessing your level of attention. That's all that happened. So it's not as though people are really getting worse. It's that they're finally developing the skill to know what's happening in their own mind with some degree of accuracy. So that's it. That's the clear seeing. It's just, we're just learning to be more perceptive about our own inner experience. And that turns out to be incredibly helpful for mental health, for well-being, a whole range of things. In fact, it turns out we have new research that's showing the microbiome changes when you learn to pay attention to your mind better.
Interesting.
So even the body changes, which is kind of remarkable.
Carol?
The concept of a good death.
Would you, Beth, hold it to your mouth, Carol.
The concept of a good death.
So Buddhism is sometimes thought to be kind of a morbid tradition because there's a lot of talk of suffering and death. And it kind of sounds like that, even just saying it comes out of my mouth. It's like, that actually does sound kind of morbid, doesn't it? But the reason for that is that these experiences of life are taught to be potent opportunities for self-discovery, basically. And in the Tibetan tradition, essentially all the major experiences that we have as humans, there are forms of meditation practice, basically ways to explore inner experience that are taught to kind of harness the power of these different life experiences. So for example, there's practices that work with the dream state, because that's where we spend a lot of our time as humans. There are meditation practices for deep dreamless sleep, believe it or not. Of course, there's all sorts of practices for waking life, and one of the main forms of practice really is training us to have a good death, not only just to encounter the process of letting go into the process of dying and eventually passing away, but actually that's viewed as one of the most potent moments for awakening. So there's a whole category of teachings. In fact, have you heard the word bardos? Is that a term? So that's a whole category, a whole kind of categorization of practices, but one of them is really training the mind so that you recognize when the process of death and dying actually happens. You actually have trained yourself to recognize the different signposts along the way, And instead of it evoking fear or, wanting to escape the experience, you actually lean in, like we talked about with anxiety or other things. You lean in, and it actually becomes this incredibly potent opportunity for discovering things about the mind and how it works. So there's a whole world around supporting people through the process of death and dying, including meditations you do throughout your life as a meditator that are essentially training that capacity. And it not only helps at that moment of death, but it also teaches us how to live. It's basically through learning how to die consciously, it teaches us how to live consciously. So this is a whole kind of world of teachings within the Tibetan tradition, but it's a very important strand of the teachings.
We have time for one more question. We might end with that story that you told me a little while ago about when you made that scientific presentation to His Holiness. That might be a good thing to end on.
And this is a story of my public humiliation at the hands of the Dalai Lama. So when I was doing my PhD work at UW-Madison, the Dalai Lama came one year and gave a series of, was giving some teachings there and came to inaugurate this new center that Richie Davidson, who is a neuroscientist who I've worked with for many years, had developed. And as part of this visit, the Center for Healthy Minds, where I did my PhD and where I continue to work, we had this public event where a group of scientists, I think there were 5 of us, gave presentations to the Dalai Lama. And this was in front of probably 200 or 300 people. And basically for 20 minutes, we got up on stage and we presented our research. The other 4 scientists were doing empirical studies. So they were gathering data, and it was usually either around the neuroscience of emotions or in some cases doing some work on early research on meditation. I, meanwhile, had just published a theoretical paper in a cognitive science journal that was a taxonomy of different forms of meditation, and basically showing from a scientific perspective how they, kind of the active ingredients in terms of the kind of the psychology of the practices and also the neural mechanisms of this practice. So basically what happened was I was giving a lecture to the Dalai Lama about meditation. So it was kind of doomed from the very beginning. That, however, was not the public humiliation. So he was very gracious, and I was like, all right, Richie asked me to do this, and I'm like, all right, who's going to turn away an opportunity to present something to His Holiness? And he was amazing. He asked questions about it, and Richie. So part of some of the work I've done in the past is I've worked as a translator for many years, and have translated a number of texts from Tibetan into English. And Richie always loved introducing me to His Holiness, and we've been with him a number of times. He always introduced me by saying he's fluent in Tibetan, he's translated all these books. Like, Richie seemed to like to tell him that. So he introduced me in that way, so he knew I spoke Tibetan. And then I gave the whole presentation. And then at the end of it, he spoke to me in Tibetan a little bit, and then he just said thank you in Tibetan. Tudiche. Very simple phrase. And Tibetan, this is hard to understand in English. For those of you who speak some Asian languages, you might be familiar with this. But in Tibetan, there are kind of levels of language depending on like the social class. Like basically if you're speaking to an elder, like you would speak very differently. You use different language if you speak to a friend versus to an elder. And for somebody like the Dalai Lama, there's like some other level which I clearly did not know. And so he just said thank you to me, like the simplest thing. And it was like total mental blank, like what is your welcome to the Dalai Lama? And and the only thing I could think of was, it was like a little bit polite, but still a little casual. It was kind of like, so I said Ke Nangi Bare, which kind of means like it's nothing or something like that. That would be the rough translation. So I sat there kind of like stunned for a minute, and then I said Ke Nangi Bare, And then he burst out laughing. he grabbed my head and kind of like this weird like bear hug. And he said, "That is so inappropriate." He was sort of like hugging me in this bear hug, and he was like laughing hysterically and saying, "So inappropriate, so inappropriate." He's like just, and everybody in the audience was like, "What did this guy say to the Dalai Lama? Did he like swear at the Dalai Lama?" And for like weeks after, people were coming up to me like, "What did you say to him?" And I ran into so he has like a professional translator who travels with him. I ran into him like a day or two later, and I finally said like, "What do you actually say to the Dalai Lama if he says thank you?" And he said, "You just look at the floor and say nothing." That probably should have been obvious. I purified lifetimes of karma in that.
Thank you all.
for coming.